Melina mai me ke aloha ya kākoa pau. Aloha, my name is Tai Kāwika Tengan, and I'm joined with Noelle Kahanu. I will do some self-introductions here, but wanted to welcome you to our talk story. Really meant to be open discussion around issues of Hawaiian warriorhood, which we've entitled Ola Koa. It's taking its inspiration from a Hawaiian Olelo Noelle, or a proverb, which means to live like a koa. And a koa in Hawaiian is a warrior. It's also the name for the Hawaiian hardwood tree that the wood is famously used for in carving canoes, as well as in other sorts of productions, such as ukulele. I think people know a lot of today. But the koa tree, really this important presence in the Hawaiian forest, which helps to give shelter and secure the ground for others to grow, is what is the part of the inspiration for bravery and courage for the Hawaiian warrior. So the Ola Koa, to live like a koa tree, to live long, to live the brave. And with that, I will hand it. My name is Tai Kāwika Tengan. I am an associate professor in ethnic studies and anthropology, and very happy to join you today. Aloha.
Aloha, Velina Maine. My name is Noelle Kahanu. And I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to be here to share space with Kāwika Tengan. And I want to thank the National Park Service for talking about sort of beyond Pearl Harbor and bringing to life stories that perhaps people are not familiar with. And I am currently an assistant specialist in public humanities and Native Hawaiian programs at the University of Hawaii, American Studies Department. Previous to this, I was at Bishop Museum for 15 years. And one of the most important projects I had the opportunity to work on was an exhibition called Hui Panala'au, Hawaiian Colonists, American Citizens. As part of that exhibition, we did oral history interviews with a number of the living, the survivors of this colonization project, one of whom was my grandfather, George Kahanu Sr. And so we're gonna start off our time together with a short 5-minute clip, which again was from a 2000 exhibition at Bishop Museum.
They looked for someone that had some Hawaiian background, and that's why they came to Kamehameha schools, to see if they can get someone from the school to participate, because of our descendants as part Hawaiians, that we would be used to the South Pacific or wherever.
The Army realized that the Kamehameha students had the right training to do something like that, and so boys were happy, proud to be there. And you know what? They got paid.
When you think that these boys were young boys, they went basically, I guess, because it was an opportunity for adventure, and they were just kind of adventuresome.
But you could smell the island before you could see it because of the guano from the birds there.
Once you get there, you wish you never got there. You're on this island just all by yourself, and it's, nothing there at all. Just birds, millions and millions of birds, and you just don't know what to do with yourself. It takes you a while to adjust to that, but once you adjust to it, it's fine.
I did not receive any kind of special training. I actually relied upon those people more senior than me, you know, and I'm recognizing the fact that whoever's making it a selection would probably consider that, okay, I'm a young man and I'll be following the senior people. So I don't think there was a need for me to receive any kind of a special preparation.
In my case, we went up to the Bishop Museum. I think Mr. Bryan was there, Ed Bryan, and he taught us how to skin the birds for the taxidermists, you know, and collect some of the plants that were grass and weeds on the island, and some specimens were put in formaldehyde.
The things that were unloaded were canned goods, things that they are not able to get right there on an isolated island. But to me, it was very idyllic because this was nature in the raw.
The frigate bird we tried was tough and it's kind of strong smell. But the booby bird tasted like chicken, tasted real good. And if you had, you know, soy, sugar, and you know, stir fried, tastes real on them. One of the things that limited our whatever we did was water. We took down and we were allotted 355 gallons of water. And you know, if you had clothes to wear, then that meant you had to wash the clothes, and water was limited. So, like Arthur said, it was very. It's reasonable that we became a nudist colony.
The best part of being on an island is feel good that we're doing something. We're doing something. You cannot put your finger on it, but it's a feeling. The barren island, 4 boys, we all had to live for 3 months together without fighting. I really enjoyed the camp school boys. I, as an outsider especially, the 3 boys, you would think that those 3 would gang up on me, but no, they didn't.
I felt that what we did there had a bearing on how this war went in the Pacific for the U.S. forces. I feel in my own heart that I feel that we did contribute.
People probably have not heard of this. And these are young men that took time out of their young lives to do things behind the scenes that they never get any recognition for. It's time that's gone from their families, time that they can never get back. For those families that lose their boys, they don't get them back.
So that was an abbreviated version of a much longer story. That longer story is told through a film called Under A Jarvis Moon, which is part of the public programming for Beyond Pearl Harbor. It's either listed in the featured films or the educational resources, but it is a 1 hour long documentary that really gets more into depth of what we saw, which was just scratching the surface. But in a nutshell, over 130 young men were sent to the islands of Howland, Baker, Jarvis, Canton, and Enderbury, so 5 islands total, between 1935 and 1942. Unfortunately, 3 of the Hawaiians, they were mostly Hawaiians that lived on these islands, passed away. And the first one was Carl Kahalewai from an appendicitis attack, and that was in 1938. And the day after Pearl Harbor was bombed, so December 8th, the island of Howland was attacked by Japanese airplanes, and Joe Keli'i Hananui and Dickie Whaley passed away. So December 8th will make 79 years since their passing. They are currently buried at the State Veterans Cemetery in Kaneohe. And so even though they were Department of Interior employees, they have been recognized for their contributions to what was essentially a military effort. Yeah, so that's sort of my brief summary, but I'm really grateful to Kāwika because he was instrumental in doing a lot of the underlying research when we were sort of unpacking this project, this exhibition, and then what ended up being this film. 20 years ago, almost now. And so I'm wondering if you want to share some of your sort of thoughts and experiences coming out of this project.
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Noelle. For my own kind of growth, it was really important as a Native Hawaiian man and as someone who's been doing research on issues of Hawaiian men and masculinities, both in the present and historically. There are some really telling stories here that helped to situate their lives within the 1930s, I think, in ways that a lot of people doing research on Hawaiian society hadn't thought through a lot. Much of the research on Hawaiian society kind of goes back to the pre-colonial days with traditional society, or looks really closely now at the kingdom era, or is more kind of 20th, 21st century. But this whole period of the territory was a really important one for thinking about. And some people feel it's sort of when Hawaiianness was lost, and I think it's quite the opposite. There's the stories of these men show that they were continuing to be very Hawaiian in their ways, even if the language perhaps was not being spoken as much, or traditional customs weren't in circulation quite as often. You still had them around, but they weren't experiencing the same kind of revitalization and resurgence that we have today. So looking at specifically what it is in the 30s, this is a time where Hawaii became a territory, which is the term Panala'au, which is the same term that these men take up when they name themselves Hui Panala'au. It means a colony or a colonist. A lot of our Hawaiian language terms are both verbs and nouns and talking about different processes. So they're the Panala'au of Hawaii, the territory of Hawaii, which was established through the 1898 Treaty of Annexation. Not Treaty of Annexation. The Joint Resolution of Annexation is something that was contested, in part because in recent scholarship we found that there was no treaty. There was no actual treaty. There's a lot of really important research that's gone into showing how Hawaiian sovereignty was diminished, but it was never completely lost, at least by legal means. So that's some of the current research, but on the ground, what does that look like in the territory? It's a plantation territory. Sugar and pineapple are dominating. Hawaiians drop to about 14% of the population, where there's a large Asian population, particularly as laborers. Politically speaking, the Hawaiian elite, the chiefs from the kingdom period and before, come to have a close alliance with the Republican Party in order to maintain power it's something that is a really important way of understanding how particular positions are afforded to Hawaiian men in this economy. Especially a lot of mid-level patronage jobs in the territory, and for Hawaiian men in particular, this affinity to the ocean. You find a lot of Hawaiian men laboring on the docks, and also getting onto many ships and becoming sailors or merchant marines, if they're not longshoremen. And this is kind of an important context because there are cultural patterns which are discernible here in terms of sailing and voyaging and being in the water. Koa, getting back to that idea, that's also the main material for canoes. So if we're thinking about some of the continuities with Hawaiian men on canoes and through their careers as warriors, the opportunity that opens up to become a part of this Hui Panelau expedition kind of makes a lot of sense. And it also is an economic one because the jobs are, even though Hawaiian men do have certain kinds of good paying jobs on the docks, many of the opportunities are far and few between, and it's the docks or the plantations, and something that allows them to also experience Hawaiianness by fishing and living on the ocean, as well as doing pretty important work, really is attractive. And so that becomes the space that the Hui Panelau emerges in.
Right. Thanks for that. And it's also, the 30s was, we're talking about coming out of the Depression. Hawaiian men in general, as where a lot of people were having trouble finding jobs, and this Hui Panelau, you got $3 a day, which was big money for them back then, right? And the fact that you couldn't spend it because they were stuck on these islands in groups of 4 meant that they were really able to save up a lot of money. And some of them did tours of like 3 or 4 months, and some of them repeated those tours and were actually on island for well over a year or more. So I think it's really critical for us to understand like how like a great gig it was in that sense, right? But the thing is, they were recruited by the federal government. A lot of them were just kids. I mean, the initial grouping in 1935 were all graduates of Kamehameha schools, which exclusively educated Native Hawaiians. But after those initial years, they just went straight to the high school. So they weren't even dealing with alumni. Like my grandfather was 17 when he went. So it's just astounding to think that there would be, today we would never, ever. But I mean, back then, routinely, kids that were in high school were being kind of sent to live on these islands, unsupervised, except living amongst themselves, right?
I did want to comment too on that. Another important context, which I almost forgot to raise with the 1930s, is it was right in the aftermath of the Massey Affair, which really involved between 1931 and 1932 these highly publicized cases, court cases, as well as acts of vigilantism, which involved the accusation by Thalia Massey, a naval lieutenant's wife, that she had been raped by 5 local men. And then they were found not guilty, but there was the subsequent murder of the darkest of these youths. And with that story, there was a greater kind of feeling of the black peril that then came to Hawaii in terms of seeing Hawaiian and other local men as menacing and menaces. And the Kamehameha schools, in many ways, presented the kind of right kind of Hawaiian male, especially because it was a school that was a military institution. And so the young men were being given a military education. And so I think in some ways they're seen as safe compared to especially the Beach Boys that had their own kind of reputation of kind of resisting a lot of the racial norms that were circulating within the territory. So that context of which Hawaiians were selected first at Kamehameha, I think, is really important. And again, Kamehameha Schools being the school established for Native Hawaiians by Bernice Pauahi Bishop, one of the last royal, at least recognized royal descendants of Kamehameha, and her estate then funding the school and to create good and industrious men and women, this being a really important reason for that selection, as well as being on the same campus as the Bishop Museum, right?
Yeah, so I think that's really critical, because what happens is Native Hawaiian men in particular, go from being vilified, right, in the national press to being kind of the quintessential American to occupy these the farthest reaches of America, these outposts. So one of the things that I think it's critical to point out to everyone is that land could not be taken or colonized by military forces. You had to have civilian occupation. So therefore they employed Native Hawaiian men specifically, and they had to know how to handle a boat, how to swim, how to be resourceful. They had to be single, in fact. And so there was very particular ways in which Hawaiian men, young Hawaiian men, were recruited for these positions. Ultimately, they did expand it to go beyond Native Hawaiians, and there were other locals that were recruited, and as well as schools outside of Kamehameha. But the one thing that I think is clear is that over the course of 7 years, there's an increased militarization. They're trained to take weather recordings. They're reporting those those weather statistics and data back through over the radios. They are taught how to identify aircraft, enemy aircraft, right? And so, but that being said, they were never issued any weapons or any means of protection. So they were kind of like sitting ducks out there in the Pacific. And in the years leading up to, and actually in the months leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, there is a commandant of the 14th Naval District who says he's thinking we should pull these guys back. So recall, there's 5 islands. There's 4 guys on each island. So there's 20 Hawaiians out there, or 20 people, young men. And that request is denied. When Pearl Harbor is bombed, they also make a critical decision to not notify or warn these guys, because by doing so and contacting them by radio, they stood that they could potentially expose their position and their location. So a strategic decision is made not to warn them. Ultimately, that decision to Hawaiians pay the price for that choice. And the last thing I'll say before we move on really is the fact of the matter is that they're not immediately rescued. We interviewed Paul Phillips, who actually two of the guys, Alvin Matson as well, who was on Howland when the attack happened. You know, a full 6 to 8 weeks go by before they're rescued. And that really has to do with the fact that obviously the military, they're engaged in the bombing of Pearl Harbor. That's not high on their priority list. And so they kind of have to eke out this existence, and they're constantly sort of subject to attack while they're out there. They finally do get to come back home in late January and early February. So and then they're told not to talk about it, right? So and then it takes the passage of decades and decades before this chapter in their story is really brought back to life. So um, like my grandfather, he thought it was this thing that he did, that he spent a few months of his life, living on an island, but it really took the passage of all this time and cobbling together the story of all the different facets for these men to realize not only the consequences and the import of their time on these islands and how it did benefit the government, but we still have 3 of these islands in our possession. Like, it's not, the impacts continue to linger. And I think, as we move on, the question really is this issue of kind of agency, that because they may have been considered expendable doesn't negate their agency and their desire to be the epitome of their school, their community, their family, and who they were representing in the time that they were on these islands, right?
Yeah. I'll take this moment to kind of transition to some of the additional research I was doing around December 7th, and in particular, this question of agency has been a really critical one for me, thinking in terms of Hawaiian men in the military, and are they, what are the possibilities for them to exercise their own agency versus being sort of the pawns of empire, right? And I think that's a question that many of us struggle with in the Hawaiian community, and as many of us have relations that are veterans and that have served in the military. I myself have not, but I have many relatives who have. This is what helped kind of spark additional research, the Hui Panama'au project, as well as these questions, which I started actually 10 years ago, back in 2010. And actually, I did want to take the time to thank the National Park Service, who, through their Hawaii Pacific Islands Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Unit Task Agreement, gave me an award to do some research on Hawaiian experiences in World War II. And I was able to do a number of different interviews with the assistance of a graduate student, Agi Kusunoki, and also very much wanted to mahalo Jeffrey White, who is my colleague and mentor from UH, and was also, I think, a previous director of the Pacific Historic Parks, or part of the board at least. And he helped to plug me into this project with the park. So, Kimiko, I'll take my PowerPoint now. Thank you. And, we can go to the first slide here. So this is today in Google Earth. There's the one pin at Pu'uloa, right at the Arizona Memorial, or World War II Valor in the Pacific Monument site, visitor center. And then the other at the top, where Kamehameha Schools is. The next slide, please. And so that was just to give you a sense of what it looked, the proximity. This is the same aerial view from 1941. And it was from the hilltop at Kamehameha, next slide, where students and faculty bore witness to the bombing of Pu'uloa that took place on December 7th. At first, many of them, through interviews that I got to do, and other oral histories that had done prior to me, and their own records. They have a very rich archive. That little kind of source at the bottom has some of their archival material they've published online. Tell the stories of the students at first thinking these are exercises, because again, the context of the 30s and early 40s was that of really a rapid militarization of the islands, with planes flying above head and target practices and bombing going on regularly. So they didn't even know it was the real McCoy, as they were saying, until the radio announcement came on and they saw the the red balls on the planes and knew that it was for real. As mentioned, Kamehameha Schools, it was actually established in the 1883 will of Bernice Poahi Bishop, great-granddaughter of Kamehameha, and who inherited most of the Kamehameha lands. Today, it's the largest private landowner and one of the largest charitable trusts in the nation. At that time, it wasn't so cash rich, but it was still an important institution for Hawaiians, one of the few private educational opportunities that Native Hawaiians had. And so, in many regards, an elite school. But as mentioned earlier, it was also one that had a very kind of American assimilationist sort of bent to it, with the boys being trained in kind of military ROTC life, 24 hours a day. They were in uniform, and it was a boarding school. And the girls in kind of home economy sorts of roles. Eventually this would change, but that was sort of the context. It was in the 30s and in the early 40s when it was starting to kind of transition more towards college prep. So next slide. As such, because of the proximity again, some of the anti-aircraft shells that were being fired ended up on campus during the attack, and this is one of the stone walls that was hit by an errant shell. There are all these other kinds of, there was another shell that ended up in a field that was kind of buried there. Nobody died or got hurt, but I mean, there was quite a lot of real concern about what was happening and could happen there. Next slide, please. Also because of the proximity and being close to Pu'uloa, the campus infirmary, Haleola, was taken over by the Army, became primarily for women and children who were injured or shocked, but then later a maternity hospital. So it ended up having this other really important role during the war, but really in the days right after, kind of taking people that were kind of fleeing from Pu'uloa. Next slide. And again, this is a campus where military life really regulates each hour. So this is a picture of the cadets from 1941, their junior reserve officer training corps. So usually all of the men were cadets. The ROTC actually was formally closed after December 7th, after everyone actually went into kind of war mode, and many of the seniors ended up being recruited to or volunteered for the Hawaii Territorial Guard. Next slide. I, through the park grant, was very fortunate to interview 3 of these seniors from the class of 1942. At the top left, Louis Kane Agard, or Buzzy Agard, as he was more known as. And in the top right, Dick Blaisdell, or Kikuni Blaisdell. Bottom left, Daniel Kahikin Akaka, the senator, and I didn't get to interview Carl Bodie, but the image of the other 3 in proximity, such as they were, also mirrored the deep friendships that they had, and also the really important role that they played later in life as advocates for the Hawaiian community, for Hawaiian sovereignty, and in very different ways. Senator Akaka fighting his pathways through the Congress and looking for recognition of a Native Hawaiian nation similar to American Indians, also very supportive of Native American and other veterans. One of the driving forces, along with Senator Noelle, in the establishment of what has recently been unveiled as the National Native American Veterans Monument, which also includes Hawaiians. Buzzy Agard, strong advocate, both for natural resources and Hawaiian governance, and quite an impressive author of really important critical works. And then Kekuni Blaisdell, really a fierce independence leader, a doctor, someone who is also very much advocate for demilitarization. So you have all of these experiences, and it was also a neat opportunity to hear them all talk together about what it was like to be on campus and responding to December 7th. So next slide. So many of the senior men, along with some of the teachers, were actually given these old World War I rifles and told to go guard the water supply up on the hill right behind the campus. They were told that Japanese paratroopers were landing, and so that they'd have to kind of guard against them and be ready to defend really the campus and the island. And they stayed overnight in shifts. Next slide. Overnight in shifts, and had many stories to tell. Fortunately, it turned out most of those reports of Japanese paratroopers were rumors. There weren't actually any up there. And next slide. Daniel Akaka, in his remembrance, as well as in my interview with him, said, the only thing that he heard was a pig, that a big mama pig with her babies, and that was the only intruder that they had. And I guess that pig wouldn't have been the intruder; they would have been the intruders up in their territory. Next slide. Buzzy Agard spoke also about the morning of December 8th, where their ROTC director, Lieutenant Ainsley Mahikoa, had a bus ready for any seniors who wanted to go downtown to volunteer for the Hawaii Territorial Guard. And so he was one of them, and he performed guard duties at various public utilities in Honolulu, around water, electricity, and telephone buildings, and also en route to Schofield, which is a base on the other side of the island. Agard and a number of the other territorial guards were detoured towards Pu'uloa, and he saw the sight of charred bodies being dragged out of the water. And even in this interview that we had back in 2010, he could still visibly and kind of viscerally remember the stench of it, which he said, lasted with you for a couple of days. He was actually discharged because he was underage, but still maintained important connections with Pu'uloa as a commercial fisherman. He also gave tours there, and he self-published a small book. So next slide, called Pacific Pearl Epic, which he kind of used to retell the story. Next slide, from his own perspective, and also marking his attendance at the Kamehameha schools as someone who engaged with that history from a different perspective as a Hawaiian. In the interview with me, he would also talk about the ways in which a number of the lands that Pearl Harbor, the naval base is right now on, previously were Kamehameha lands, and they were actually confiscated by the military when the base was being built up. And this, along with other histories of land condemnations, tend to be the story of the Hawaiian struggle to maintain connections to home when it's being overrun, and when they're being alienated from the lands by various forces, including the military, but also the other broader forces. And at the time of this, those of sugar and pineapple, increasingly now with tourism and development. So the stories that they tell are important to also be retold. Okay, next slide. As I kind of wrap up here, I just wanted to note that they all, like the man that we got to interview from the Hui Punala'au, had very fond memories of their time. And my talk is kind of focused here at Kamehameha, but I think equally it could be said of Hawaiians across the islands. There's, I think, a deeper sense of community that a lot of them felt they had during the territorial period, whether it was on campus at Kamehameha or just living in a smaller island community where people knew each other, they could leave the doors open and you didn't have to worry about it. And many of the changes that they started to see, initiated by the war, and then later tourism development that followed statehood, and increasingly less I think, authority and roles within the islands led. Well, that's what led to the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, right? Because they're increasingly being displaced in the 60s and onward. And people like Kekuni Blaisdell became this fierce advocate for Hawaiian independence, even as he still had these deep connections with institutions such as Kamehameha schools, which were very militarized. At the same time, they created this deep sense of family. Similar things were being told to us by men that were part of the Hui Panala'au. And I think there is, some deep contradictions, perhaps, or maybe that's just how life is. That it's never just black and white. And part of it, I think, was also these spaces enabling them to fulfill their kuleana, their responsibilities as koa, right, as warriors, to show bravery, to be able to support their own communities, to create these environments for themselves and for their families that would help others to grow. So, again, despite Uncle Kekuni's own very strong stance on demilitarization and independence, he still very fondly had these recollections of military life in Kamehameha. He later went on to serve in the Korean War as a battalion surgeon, and then after that did some really important studies on the effects of the nuclear bombs in Japan, and came here back to Hawaii to be one of the first chairs, I think, of the medical school, and of Hawaiian studies as well. Next slide. So if you go up to Kamehameha now, there is a monument right above the girls' dorms. Next slide. And it was dedicated to these senior men of Kamehameha who went up into the Kuahivi with these old rifles and were ready to defend their campus. And again, as much as this is a chaos story, I think it really speaks to the ethos that many Hawaiians in other schools and other places had. Regardless of what flag was flying, there's an allegiance to the land, to the aina, that kind of runs through and continues to the present. All right, next slide. And just to flag a couple of other texts for folks, two very famous Native Hawaiian veterans who are now passed, but spent a great deal of time down at the Arizona Memorial and the Visitor Center, Herb Weatherwax and Al Rodriguez. Their books, which are published by Pacific Historic Parks, are available for people who want to hear their first-person accounts. And again, my colleague and friend Jeff White has a really important text on memorializing Pearl Harbor that isn't so much Hawaiian focused, but really takes up some of the Hawaiian counter memory as a part of the broader context for thinking about Pu'uloa. And sorry, I just kind of went on and on and on and on, but Noelle, feel free to, if you want to add in anything with any of that I covered.
Yeah, well, I would be remiss if I did not point out that actually after Hui Panala'au, or after that project, my grandfather went to the military, but then he ended up coming back and he was actually employed on base as a ship fitter, right, for at Pearl Harbor. And so he was there. They were waiting for the shop to open when Pearl Harbor was attacked. And so he actually, there was an interview that Kāwika came over to his kitchen in Maui and we're interviewing him, and then he astoundingly went out and brought back his toolbox, which he had kept. So my grandfather, he lived till he was 98 years old. But anyway, he literally had his toolbox, which now, which he handed over to Kāwika, and it's now in the collections of the National Park Service. But he was one of the last surviving civilian employees of Pearl Harbor to survive, and passed away a few years ago. But anyway, I'm really grateful for this time to just talk story with you, but just, so for Hawaiians, it's like, right, the makahiki season, it's a time of renewal, it's a time of reflection, it's a time, for healing, and that's, those kinds of emotions always come up for me around December 7th, around December 8th. I always take flowers up to the boys, and on December 8th, I meet one of the nieces, or Nera Ka'a. We usually meet at noon, just to spend a little bit of time in reflection. So I'm very grateful to the Park Service for allowing our conversation to be a part of a broader reflection on moving beyond Pearl Harbor. So at this point, I'm wondering whether we should open up for questions, or do you think that we can? I actually want to ask Kāwika a question. So since we're moderating ourselves, I actually do want to ask this. So, and this has to do with really sort of the role of people of color in the U.S. military. And, as we think about it sort of at a point in time where they were not allowed, or they were rejected in terms of their ability to participate, and then reluctantly allowed, then you have sort of the 442, we'll use that as one example of really exemplary service by Japanese Americans. And now we're talking about really a targeting of people of color, especially Pacific Islanders, which are they're really overrepresented in terms of population, right? Overrepresented in who currently is being recruited and is in the military. So I'm just wondering, kind of, what do you make of this sort of changing relationship that the military has had and continues to have with really communities of color?
Yeah, this was one of my really core questions, thinking through the research I was doing specifically on Hawaiians, which then opened up to the broader discussion of Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders and other people of color in the military, how the military, on the one hand, is precisely the force that has led to the loss of Hawaiian sovereignty and diminished sovereignties across the Pacific, including of the Kofa nations, those that have a compact of free association with the U.S., including Federated States of Micronesia, Marshall Islands, and Palau. And then American Samoa is its continuing status as a territory. And so on the one hand, it's the U.S. basing of empire in the Pacific to facilitate its military economic interests, really with an eye towards Asia. And on the other hand, it's also this space that many of the men, and I was mainly interviewing men, and I don't want to say that there are not women, and there really are. My interests have been in masculinities, but women, as well as non-binary individuals too, that have been in these military spaces that find, on the one hand, what you might expect, one of the few economic opportunities. This tends to be one of the main driving forces for these overrepresentation of Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders in these spaces. So one of the few economic opportunities afforded in islands that have really suffered pretty intentional underdevelopment on the part of the U.S. and the roles it was supposed to have played after the war. But on the other hand, it's also been these avenues for fulfilling obligations to family, to land, and otherwise that are part of cultures that have come to be and have previously had warrior traditions in them. And so I think it's complex. It's a hard question. I think there's always this danger, again, getting back to your question of agency, right, of Pacific Islanders and Hawaiians losing agency in these institutions, but it's also one that they found agency and ability to accomplish in economies and in cultural spaces that they've become marginalized in, whether it's in Hawaii or in the U.S. or in other island nations. And that's just from that perspective. And there's a broader, again, conversation too with thinking of African American, Latinx, and other people of color within the military. But the 442nd, I think, is a perfect example. People today really only think about the Japanese American unit from World War II. But today's 100th Battalion 442nd is almost all Pacific Islanders who've gone into there primarily because of economics, but also because of other island obligations.
Yeah. Maybe a good film to recommend too is Island Soldier, right? It's a documentary, but it really follows they're in Guam, right? That film.
I think the Chuuk. I mean, I think the focus is on certain islands in Chuuk in the Federated States of Micronesia, but it also includes Guam and others. I'm trying to remember the exact individuals that were in that film. There's that one, and then there's Insular Empire, which is another one that both look really closely at Pacific Islanders in the military today.
Yeah, so we have here an audience question. Do you have any stories about the response after December 7th? Perhaps like salvage effort?
Yes. In particular, well, I mean, your grandfather, right? Didn't he talk a little bit about having to kind of just get to work right away?
Yeah, so they were all enlisted in the rescue effort because they were welders. So they were immediately put to the task of trying to open up some of the ships that had been, fatally attacked in terms of trying to get in, trying to help those that were trapped. Arthur Harris actually was also one of the ones that reflects on remembering what that experience was like. They worked through the night. He ended up catching a ride back to his home in Kaimuki. And my grandmother, his wife, actually was surprised to see him because she wasn't sure he had survived the attack. And then they started it all over again, 4 or 5 in the morning. They suited up and went back to work. So yeah, there were lots of locals that were engaged in the post December 7th cleanup and rescues.
I want to share some pictures, if it's okay with you, Noelle, of that time that you mentioned of interviewing your grandfather.
Glasses.
Is this showing? I'm not sure if it's popping up here.
Yeah, I see it. All his tools.
There he is with the tools and his glasses that he wore.
Those were the goggles.
Oh, look at that. Wow, and his beautiful daughter, Kildauna, Hattie, and the ship.
It's like it was in museum quality condition, all this stuff that he had kept.
Look at that. And so there it was, that history that, we were fortunate to have heard the story from, and now sits in the archives at the park somewhere.
Yeah, hopefully. Does anybody else have any questions they want to ask? I was one of the things that I read, and I forgot what the source was, but maybe you know, was the fact that when Hawaiians were in the military, especially at the point in time where they were actually segregating African Americans and keeping them in organizing them, keeping them separately. Hawaiians were actually part of the general population. So I find that interesting that when it came to culturally or ethnically or by skin color, for whatever reason, Hawaiians seem to operate to a certain extent kind of outside of those typical designations. Is that what you found?
Right, yeah. I want to say my colleague Keaulani Kawanui, who was doing a lot of research on race in the territory, might have come across some of this, the categories that Hawaiians fell into, and perhaps my other colleague Daviana McGregor, who's done quite a lot of research on the territory. But indeed, yeah, the Hawaiians somehow just got, because I think of the ways in which the U.S. really never knew how to deal with us. And I think also in part because of certain racial ideologies that emerged even within the eugenics period, within the 30s and 40s, Hawaiians kind of occupied a strange place, in part because I think there's so much interracial mixing and marriage going on. But even prior to that, my great grandfather was in World War I. He didn't actually have to deploy anywhere, but he was in the army in the territory at the time, and his card says white on it. So I think it's a matter of how, after annexation and during the territorial period, how Hawaii was this place where I think U.S. was trying to work through what race meant as it kind of became a new imperial power and now had all these different colonies, essentially Panala'au, in the Pacific. And so Hawaiians defined the kind of black-white dichotomy, ended up being white. And again, we now have better thinking on race, supposedly better thinking. I don't know, it's a little bit questionable. But that's, yeah, I would agree with what you're pointing to here.
Yeah, I'm really struck by the way in which, unless there are oral histories, unless there's photographs, unless there's some sort of testament to their presence, then stories really are lost. So so I think that the need really speaks to the need for ongoing research in uncovering and reclaiming and documenting these stories of Hawaiians in occupying really critical roles, right, at critical moments in America's history. And I do think a lot of times when people think about America, right, they're not necessarily thinking about beyond the 50 states. They're not thinking about all the other territories that defined that broader sense of what constitutes America today, and the contributions and sacrifices of those people for whom the U.S. made very deliberate choices about claiming and maintaining sovereign control over these islands. So I think that it always behooves us to remember all of the sacrifices collectively that all of us make, and to think about what it means to be part of this American story, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it. So it's 5 p.m. We're like right on time. So is there any final thoughts you want to share?
Just a big mahalo to you Noelle for all the work that you've done for these many years in telling the stories and really advocating for our Kanaka in all the different spaces they are. Again, for all who have tuned in to listen to us and Pacific Historic Parks, thanks for letting us share these stories of Koa.
We I want to add to that by saying that in 2015 there was an effort for Hui Panala'o to be recognized in a Senate resolution. We did get it passed, but I do think that in retrospect, ultimately what matters is that the community remembers. It's not about what some government body does 5,000 miles away. It's really the fact that we here as a community remember these stories, and that's what makes opportunities like this so important. And these stories live in everyone who participated today. So I just want to thank you for spending the time with us, for listening us to keeping these stories of our koa alive. Ola na koa.
Ola.